the kind of broad base, I mean, you have thousands of people a year on your show. You talk to a lot of libertarian audiences. You're a crowd favorite. I mean, you are the rock star of Freedom Fest in Las Vegas every year. And other
it's only because you weren't there this year.
But how many people agree with you who call themselves libertarian, would you guess? And
I would say that about half of our libertarian colleagues are pro-life, and about half are not.
Well, and then you had mentioned that it's for you, it's a matter of science and of faith. One of the chapters in your book, which I think is wonderful, is you quote from the great play A Man for All Seasons, which is about Thomas More. And you call it When the Devil Turned Round on You, which is a line about how you need to understand the state needs to be relatively powerless, because once it becomes powerful enough to do what you want, then it can turn on you. What's the role of faith? You are a practicing Catholic. A lot of libertarians seem hostile to religion or indifferent to religion. What's the role of your religious beliefs in your belief in individual dignity and rights?
I am not just a Catholic. I have to characterize this today because of what's been happening to the Catholic Church in the past 50 years. I am a pre-Vatican II Catholic. I am a traditionalist with a capital T. I am an Orthodox with a lowercase o, Roman Catholic. I know you're laughing because you and I have talked about this till we're blue in the face.
It's also because I'm mentally typing and shifting capital to lowercase.
Right.
But,
well, I can't say uppercase O because then you're not Roman, then you're Eastern.
Yes.
Everything I do or say is filtered through my internal screen of Catholicism. I am thrilled beyond compare at the number of libertarians who carry rosary beads in their pockets. Think of the message of Jesus. The individual is greater than the state. I am here to save individuals in spite of the state. This is a libertarian message, if ever there was one. Doesn't mean you have to be Catholic. Doesn't mean you even have to believe in God. If you believe, as I do, that we were created in the image and likeness of God, then as God is perfectly free, we are perfectly free. If you believe that we are the highest result of some natural selection, then you also believe that that highest result, humanity, has free will and intellect to exercise that free will. Either origin, biological or theological, gets you to the point of the primacy of the individual over its artificial organization based on a monopoly of force, which we call the government.
Jesus is also remembered for saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." How do you tell the difference? I mean, you talk a lot in your books consistently and in your show about natural law, higher law. Explain that for people who might not be familiar with it, and how does that help you decide, okay, well, Caesar has a legitimate claim on this, but not on this?
The natural law teaches, this is Aristotle, this is Aquinas, this is Thomas More, this is John Locke, this is Thomas Jefferson, this is Clarence Thomas, to some extent, Nino Scalia as well. I mean them no disrespect by calling them by their first names. Argument is that our rights come from our humanity, that my right to think as I wish and speak as I think and publish as I speak, to worship or not to worship, self-defense, privacy, my right to be left alone, are integral to my existence. I have them because I'm a human being. They don't come from the government. That's not an academic argument, because if these rights do come from the government, then the government by ordinary legislation or executive command can restrict those rights. If they come from my humanity, then the Fifth Amendment comes in. The government can only interfere with those rights, life, liberty, or property, with due process, meaning show me what I did wrong, prove it to a neutral jury, let me defend myself and challenge you, and give me the right to appeal. Basic due process.
But then also, it's not simply procedural due process, right? It's substantive, because your book, Dred Scott's Revenge, which is a fascinating history of race and law in America, I mean, you take issue with the Dred Scott decision.
Because some things are just plain wrong. Right. And to suggest that one class of people can enslave another class of people, not because of any culpability on the part of the enslaved class, but just by virtue of their place of origin or the color of their skin, violates substantive due process, which basically means the law has to be fair. It has to be, as Aquinas would have said and did say, a rule of right reason for the common good, not a rule of convenience for the good of some.
So where does taxation fit into that? So the income tax as opposed to excise taxes, because the federal government, before we had a personal income tax, most of their money came from tariffs and excise taxes. Are those moral and income tax immoral, or are both moral? Or
You're home at night and someone knocks on the door and you answer the door and there's a guy with a gun and the guy says, "Give me your money, I want to give it away in your name." Was this guy crazy? You call the police, you find out he's an IRS agent. So that's what taxation is. It is the government extracting money from you against your will to give it away in your name. I'll say this plainly, I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do. When the government imposed excise taxes, that was a user fee. You want to use the government's port. The government owns the water and owns the earth. It shouldn't, but it does. You have to pay for that right. So before the war between the states, the central government existed by user fees. It existed by selling government land. Government still owns, what, 88% of Nevada. That's a lot of land. And it also existed by imposing burdens on the states, financial burdens, for the services the central government performed. That's the way it was intended to be. After the 16th and 17th Amendments, the Senate is no longer representative of the states, and the feds can take a portion of your income tax. The feds take whatever they want. If those two amendments alone were to be repealed, the government would go back to the confines of the Constitution almost overnight.
now, it's funny. You talked about the war between the states as opposed to the Civil War.
You call it the Civil War. I don't want to get snarky.
I was going to ask now here clearly, and you mentioned Lincoln in a negative way. Lincoln, in many ways, is the worst violator of the Constitution. When you run through what he did in order to prosecute the Civil War, the Confederate States of America, worse still, because they were fighting for the right to maintain slavery, right?
I believe that they were fighting for a right to secede from a central government, just as we seceded from Great Britain. They were also fighting for slavery, the worst abomination in the history of the world. But it is not the job of the United States of America to go around and looking for monsters to slay, which is what Lincoln did.
Yeah. So put yourself back in 1860. Would you have joined an Abraham Lincoln Brigade, obviously named something different, at the time maybe a John Brown Brigade, to go in and help overthrow the Confederate States of America?
I think that slavery would have died a natural death here, as it did in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, in Portugal, and in Great Britain. And I think it was on the verge of doing that at the time Lincoln decided to start killing people.
In your book, you quote, I guess Thomas Paine, and then you said it goes back to Aquinas, but that we have a positive moral duty to disobey stupidity.
Right.
In the same chapter, you also talk about, and I'm quoting here, wise folks are buying guns and gold. Are you getting militant? Are you going to be having Patty Hearst on your show anytime soon?
She's still
wearing
around.
a beret? But what are you getting at there? And at what point does the positive moral duty to disobey stupidity and to refuse to go along with laws that are immoral, does that sanction violence against the state?
There's a potential for violence.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not encouraging violence. But Aquinas taught us that an unjust law is no law at all. And the sit-ins at the lunch counters in the South in the 50s and 60s, these are courageous people who were using nonviolent means to resist and reject an unjust law, Jim Crow law. The Jim Crow laws compelled the lunch counter owner to segregate by sex, whether the lunch counter owner wanted to do it or not. The evil was the law. The evil was not the person behind the lunch counter. The Southern legislatures lacked the political will to change that. The Southern courts lacked the political and the intellectual will to change it. It was only a nonviolent refusal to obey an unjust law that changed it. That's what I'm talking about. Right. Bring it to today, we'll go back to our friends in the library in Bridgeport. The end of that story is a happy one, by the way, because on the eve of the trial of the, by then, 87-year-old librarian and her 77-year-old assistant, a federal judge said to the U.S. attorneys, "I'm about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to go after these two ladies for discussing this warrant?" Suddenly, the case disappeared. Lately, another sub-rosa trend I'll tell you about. Federal agents serving self-written search warrants on, say, a person who owns a computer store wanting to know who bought a mobile phone or who bought a laptop. They're not complying with it. They're taking it to a lawyer and challenging it. And what are judges doing? Invalidating it. Is that a technical violation of the Patriot Act? Yes, it is. Does it result in a greater freedom? Yes, it does. Is it an example of violating an unjust law without obstructing a governmental function and without causing violence? Yes, it is. So that's what I'm talking about at the end. In terms of guns and gold, they are the only material things that will save us.
Talk about Occupy Wall Street real briefly, because they believe that they are protesting, in the name of a higher law, of righteousness. Where do you find them mistaken?
We sent some of our Freedom Watch producers down there to interact with them, and we were surprised at what we found. And this is a month ago now. I know this is changing by the minute. I believe it has since been taken over by the Democratic Party and professional activists. But before that happened, at least in the crowds that we interviewed in Lower Manhattan in late September, about a third of the people were wearing pins or carrying flags that said, "Don't tread on me." And of the demands of the crowd, and the Fed, and the wars, and the IRS, the Wall Street crowd was going along with the first two. Now, the lefties don't want to end the IRS. They want to use the IRS to steal more than it already steals. And the other day I was speaking at a group, and some of these folks showed up. I couldn't hear what they were saying because they were screaming so loud. I said, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. The crowd loved it, and they loved it. I welcome this controversy. I welcome this dispute. Obviously, I condemn the notion that the government should use its power to take from those who have and give to those who have not. But to the extent that this causes a debate about the fundamental role of government in our lives, it's a good one. The issue in New York is a bizarre one because it's private property dedicated to the public use by the force of law. It's a bad law. You should be able to invite and exclude whomever you want on your own private property. The city of New York does not permit that because the city of New York barely recognizes private property rights.
Well, I want to thank Judge Andrew Napolitano, the host of Freedom Watch on Fox Business, Monday through Friday. It's a great show, and also the author now, most recently, of It is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government is Wrong. Judge, thanks very much for talking to Reason TV.
Thank you for coming on my show once a week. We love it.
I appreciate that very much. For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.